She was standing on the porch of my beach house at 7 in the morning, with 2 suitcases, and my stepfather's car idling in the driveway when I opened the front door. The ocean was behind her. The light was that particular early coastal light, flat and white, and slightly cool before the sun fully commits to the day. She had her reading glasses pushed up into her hair the way she always did when she expected a conversation to go a certain direction, and she was smiling in the way of someone who has already decided the outcome and is simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. She said, "We're here. I hope you made up the guest room." I looked at her. Then at the suitcases. Then at Gerald's car in the driveway. Gerald himself sitting in the passenger seat scrolling his phone, apparently unconcerned with the logistics of arriving unannounced at someone's home at 7 on a Saturday morning. I said, "What happened to the house?" She said, "I'll explain inside. Put the kettle on." I stood in the doorway for a moment. Behind her, a pelican crossed the sky in that unhurried way pelicans have, heading somewhere with complete certainty. Then I stepped back and let her in. Not because I did not already understand what had happened, but because I needed to know exactly how much she believed she had gotten away with before I responded. That morning was the end of something that had been building for nearly 2 years. To understand it properly, you need to know how it started. My name is Rachel Donovan. I am 44 years old. I work as a family law paralegal at a mid-sized firm in Raleigh, North Carolina, a job that requires a particular kind of precision about property, documentation, and the legal weight of words. I have spent 16 years helping attorneys build cases around real estate disputes, estate contests, and the complicated aftermath of family decisions that seemed simple at the time. I know what a deed transfer looks like. I know what a quitclaim means. I know the difference between a gift and a sale, between a voluntary transfer and a coerced one, and I know which of those carries legal weight and which one does not. I mention this not to position myself as someone who was impossible to fool. I mention it because the particular thing my mother did took advantage of the one vulnerability that professional expertise cannot entirely protect against: the assumption that the people who love you are not practicing on you. I had bought the beach house 3 years earlier, not on the North Carolina coast. Further south, a small barrier island off the Georgia coast that had managed to stay quiet, mostly because the bridge onto it was narrow, and the parking was difficult, and the kind of people who needed a wide bridge and easy parking had gone elsewhere. The house was a raised cottage on the sound side, with a screened porch that ran the full length of the back, and a view of the marsh that changed color with the light throughout the day. I had bought it with money I saved over 11 years, and the mortgage was mine alone. And I had never in my life been as certain about any decision as I was the day I signed those papers. My mother's name was Patricia. She was 68, recently remarried to a man named Gerald Marsh, who had retired from a career in commercial insurance, and who I had met 4 times before their wedding and found, in each of those 4 meetings, to be pleasant and opaque in equal measure. He was the kind of man who agreed with things, rather than having opinions about them, which I had initially found inoffensive and had gradually come to understand as a form of cover. My mother and Gerald lived in the house in Cary, a suburb of Raleigh, the house where I had grown up, the house my mother had received in her divorce from my father 15 years earlier and had owned outright for the past 8. 4 bedrooms, a backyard that backed up to a small creek, a covered front porch with 2 rocking chairs she had bought the summer I graduated from college. I drove to that house for dinner every other Sunday. I had done this for most of my adult life. The first sign that something was shifting came about 18 months before the morning with the suitcases. My mother called me on a Tuesday afternoon. Not unusual. She called often, but the quality of the call was different. She wanted to talk about the beach house, not about coming to visit, which she did periodically, not about the upkeep, but about the structure of it, who held the deed, whether there was a mortgage, what would happen to it if anything happened to me. I answered her questions. They were not unreasonable questions for a mother to ask. I did not register anything specific until after we hung up, and even then, I told myself she was simply getting older and thinking about the future in the way that older people sometimes did. On the kitchen counter of my rental apartment in Raleigh I rented in the city during the week and drove to the beach house on weekends when I could manage it. There was a wristwatch that had stopped working 2 years earlier and that I kept meaning to take to a watchmaker and kept forgetting. My grandmother's watch, passed down when she died. Small face, narrow leather band. The kind of watch that had been beautiful in its era and remained so even stopped. I had worn it to the closing on the beach house for luck, which was not something I typically did, and it had been sitting on the kitchen counter since I got home that afternoon, because I could not quite bring myself to put it away. The discovery did not arrive as a single moment. It arrived as a sequence of small pieces that I assembled over a Tuesday evening in March, at my kitchen table in Raleigh, after a phone call from a real estate agent I had never heard of. Her name was Donna Fields. She was calling, she said, as a courtesy. She understood I might not have been informed, and she wanted to make sure the relevant parties were aware of the timeline. She was representing buyers who had recently gone under contract on the property at 14 Whitfield Court in Cary. I said, "I'm sorry, which property?" She said, "Whitfield Court, the residential property. I understood you were a family member of the seller." I sat very still in my kitchen chair. I said, "Can you tell me who the seller is listed as?" She said, "Patricia Marsh." The kitchen was quiet. Through the window above the sink, the streetlight outside had just flickered on in that particular way. Streetlights do in early March when the evenings are still arriving faster than expected. I looked at the light for a moment. I said, "Thank you for calling, Donna. Can you tell me the expected closing date?" She gave me a date 6 weeks away. She said she hoped everything was in order and wished me a good evening. I put the phone down on the table. My mother had listed the family home for sale. Not the beach house, the Cary house, the house that was hers to sell. She had every legal right to sell it. That was not the part that made my stomach tighten. The part that made my stomach tighten was the phone call I had received from Gerald 3 days earlier, which I had almost forgotten in the ordinary business of the week. He had called while I was in a meeting and left a voicemail saying he and my mother were thinking about their next chapter and wondering whether we might have a family conversation sometime soon about what the future looked like for everyone. At the time, I had thought, "That's vague." Now I thought, that was not vague at all. I picked up my phone and texted my mother. "Can we talk this week?" She texted back within 2 minutes. "Of course. How about Sunday dinner? I'll make your favorite," her favorite. She had already decided. I could hear it in the punctuation. I set the phone down and looked at the stopped watch on the kitchen counter. Just sitting there on the tile, its hands frozen at 2:10. The leather band slightly curled at the edges from years of not being worn. I thought about what Donna Fields had said, 6 weeks to closing. I did not call my mother that night. I needed to think before I spoke. And thinking, in my professional life, meant starting with the documents. The first thing I did was pull the public property records for 14 Whitfield Court. This is something anyone can do. Property records in North Carolina are public documents, available through the County Register of Deeds. But I had been doing it professionally for 16 years, and I knew exactly what to look for and where to find it quickly. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, and within 20 minutes, I had the full chain of title for the Cary house, going back 30 years. The deed history was straightforward. My mother had received the property in the divorce settlement with my father 15 years ago. The deed had been in her name alone since then. No liens, no encumbrances, clear title. She had the absolute legal right to sell it. What the public records also showed me, and what I had not known until I looked, was a document filed 8 months earlier. A transfer on death deed, recorded quietly at the Wake County Register of Deeds in July of the previous year, naming Gerald Marsh as the sole beneficiary of the property upon my mother's death. I read it twice. My mother had not mentioned this document. I was not required to know about it. It was her property, and she could designate any beneficiary she chose. But the combination of this document and the sale now in progress told me something important about the sequence of events. She had arranged Gerald's inheritance before listing the house, which meant the sale and whatever came next had been planned as a package. The transfer on death deed was irrelevant now that the property was being sold, but its existence told me the planning had started months before the phone call from Donna Fields. My colleague at the firm, a woman named Janelle, who had been a paralegal for 22 years, and who had the particular quality of seeing the practical implications of things very quickly, met me for lunch on Thursday. I spread the documents across the corner table at the restaurant, where we usually went, a small place near the office, with good soup and tables, far enough apart that you could speak privately. Janelle read through everything without speaking. When she finished, she looked at me across the table. She said, "Rachel, what does your mother think is going to happen after the closing?" I said, I was not certain yet, that she had made reference to a family conversation about the future. Janelle set the papers down. She said, "She sold the house. She has nowhere to go. She's been to your beach house 6 times in the past 2 years. She asked you about the deed structure 18 months ago." I said, "Yes," Janelle said. "She's expecting to move in with you, not temporarily." I had arrived at this conclusion myself the previous evening, but hearing someone else say it plainly made it real in a different way. That is sometimes what you need. Not new information, but confirmation from someone who is not inside the thing with you, she said. "Does she understand that this is your property, that her name is not on it?" I said, "She understands it legally. I'm not sure she believes it applies to her." Janelle looked at the documents again. She said, "There's a difference between someone who doesn't know the law and someone who knows it and has decided it doesn't apply to them. You need to figure out which one this is." She was right, and I suspected I already knew the answer. Over the following 3 weeks, I did what I had been trained to do. I requested the full purchase contract from the county clerk's office, available as a public record once filed, and read through every page. The sale price was $412,000. After realtor commission and closing costs, my mother would clear approximately $370,000. That was not a small amount of money. It was also not enough to purchase property on the Georgia coast, where prices had increased substantially in the past several years, and where the inventory of anything worth buying had been limited for longer than that. I also looked at my own mortgage documents, which I had kept meticulously filed since the day I closed on the beach house. My name was on the deed, only my name. My mother's name appeared nowhere on any document related to that property. This was not something I had arranged with any particular foresight. I had simply bought a house, and her name had not been relevant to the transaction. The detail that I kept returning to, during those 3 weeks, was the transfer on death deed, not its content, but its timing. 8 months before the sale listing. That meant my mother had been thinking about the future, specifically about where she and Gerald would live, for at least 8 months before she told me the house was being sold, possibly longer. The phone call about the deed structure 18 months ago suggested longer. I thought about all the Sunday dinners during that period, the ordinary conversations, her asking about the marsh view and whether the screened porch was comfortable in the evenings, and whether I had thought about adding a second bathroom. Questions I had answered as a daughter, not as a property owner being assessed. Before I tell you what I found next, tell me, what time is it where you are right now? Where are you watching from? I'm always surprised how far these stories travel. What I found in the 4th week of my investigation was something I had not anticipated looking for. I pulled Gerald's financial records, not private records, which I had no access to, but public ones. Court filings, business registrations, property records in his name across the 3 counties where he had lived over the past 20 years. This is standard due diligence in property disputes, the kind of background work I did routinely for the firm's clients. What I found was this. Gerald had owned 2 properties before his marriage to my mother. He had sold both of them in the 2 years prior to the wedding. The proceeds of those sales, totaling approximately $260,000, were not reflected in any subsequent property purchase or documented investment. This was not evidence of wrongdoing. People spend money, but it established something relevant. Gerald was not a man of independent means, in the way that his retired professional presentation suggested. The commercial insurance career had been real. The retirement income was presumably real, but the asset base I would have expected to see, given the career and the lifestyle, was not there. My mother was selling a $370,000 house. Gerald had arrived in the marriage without significant assets, and neither of them, as far as any public record showed, had made any arrangement for where they would live after the closing, except for the questions my mother had been asking me about my beach house for 18 months. I sat with all of this for a long time. The stopwatch was on the counter of my Raleigh kitchen, the night I finished compiling the full picture, sitting there exactly as it had been for 2 years, face-up hands at 2:10, the leather band slightly more curled than it used to be. I picked it up and held it for a moment. Then I put it back down and called an attorney. By the time I had everything I needed, 6 weeks had passed. The closing on the Carey house had occurred the previous Thursday. My mother had called that evening and said the sale had gone smoothly and that she was looking forward to seeing me on Saturday. I knew what Saturday meant. I was ready. The attorney I called was not someone from my firm. I was a paralegal, not an attorney, and the conflict of interest of using my employer for personal matters would have been untenable regardless. I called a woman named Frances Obi, who had been in property law in Raleigh for 19 years, and who I had worked opposite in 2 cases over the past decade. She was thorough and direct, and had a gift for explaining complicated things simply, which I valued because I needed clarity more than I needed to be impressed. I came to her office on a Thursday morning with a binder I had assembled over the previous 3 weeks. The public property records for the Carey house, the deed history of the beach cottage, my mortgage documents, the transfer on death deed Gerald had been designated under, and the summary I had written of Gerald's public financial records and their gaps. Frances read through the binder carefully. When she finished, she set it on her desk and looked at me. She said, "Your property is secure. Your name is on the deed, your name alone, and there is no legal mechanism by which your mother or Gerald can claim any right to it without your consent." I said, "I know that. What I need is to understand my options if they arrive and refuse to leave." Frances nodded. She said, "Then we are talking about trespass and unlawful occupation, which in Georgia, where the property is located, has a specific legal process for removal." She explained the process: a formal notice, a waiting period, and if the notice was not complied with, a civil filing that would result in a court order for removal. She also said something I had not quite articulated to myself. Your mother may genuinely not understand that owning a property and having a right to occupy it are different things, or she may understand it and be counting on the social pressure of the situation to override the legal reality. Either way, the response is the same: a clear, documented assertion of your rights, made before they are in a position to claim established presence. I asked her what established presence meant in practical terms. She said, if someone is occupying a property with the apparent permission of the owner, and the owner does not act to correct that within a reasonable period, it creates complications. The law disfavors displacement. Your best position is to be clear before they arrive, not after. I told her they were arriving on Saturday. She said, "I'll have a letter prepared by Friday." I drove home from her office in the late afternoon. The light over Raleigh in late spring had that long gold quality that extended the day beyond when it should reasonably end. I came into my apartment and stood in the kitchen for a while. The watch was on the counter. I picked it up and thought about my grandmother. Not in a sentimental way, just in the way of noticing. My grandmother had been a woman who kept her documents in order and her property in her own name. She had told me once, during the summer I turned 22, that the most important thing a woman could own was something that was hers on paper. Not in practice, not in the understanding of the people around her. On paper. I had done that. The beach house was mine on paper. I put the watch down and started preparing for Saturday. The 3rd week of the investigation was the one that changed the texture of everything. I had been going through my own memories as carefully as the documents. Not as evidence exactly, but as context. The HR work I did required this kind of retrospective reading, taking events that seemed ordinary at the time and asking what they looked like with better information. I had been doing it professionally for years. Doing it about my own family was different in the way that things are always different when they are about you. But the method was the same. I thought about the Sunday dinners. Specifically, I thought about the ones in the past 18 months. And I tried to remember what my mother had asked about. and what she had not asked about. She had asked about the beach house often, the upkeep, the insurance, whether the roof had been inspected recently, whether the rental income covered the mortgage in the off-season. Questions I had answered without registering their cumulative direction. Questions that, laid out in sequence, sounded less like a mother's curiosity and more like due diligence. She had asked, once, whether I had thought about putting the house in a trust. I had told her I had spoken to an estate attorney and was satisfied with my current arrangements. She had nodded and moved on. I had not thought about it again until now. Janelle called me on a Wednesday evening during the third week, not to discuss the matter, but to check in. She had the quality, rare in anyone, of knowing when to reach out without being asked. She said, "How are you doing with it?" Not the legal part, the other part. I told her I was fine. Then I said, "Actually, I'm not entirely sure," she said. "That's more honest." I told her what I was sitting with, not the documents but the memories, the Sunday dinners, the binocular questions, the way my mother had looked at the marsh view the last time she visited and said it was the most peaceful thing she had seen in years. Janelle was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Rachel, here is the thing about the people who love us and still do things that are not okay. They usually genuinely believe they are not doing anything wrong. That is not an excuse. It is just important to know, because it tells you what you are actually dealing with. You are not dealing with malice. You are dealing with someone who arranged what she needed and assumed you would accept it because you always have." I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. She was right, and it was the truest and most uncomfortable thing anyone said to me during those weeks, that my mother's confidence in the plan had come from knowing me, from correctly predicting, based on a lifetime of evidence, that I would absorb it. That was the part I had to decide what to do with. The stopped watch was on the counter the night I finished the full picture. I had not moved it in 3 weeks. It had just sat there while I worked at the kitchen table, its hands at 2:10, its leather band slightly curled. My grandmother had worn it every day. She had never assumed anyone would take care of her. She had taken care of herself and let the people she loved benefit from that, rather than the other way around. I picked the watch up, set it back down, called Frances, and told her I needed the letter ready by Friday. The welcome I had prepared was not dramatic. It did not involve raised voices or a scene on the porch. It was a letter, printed on Frances Obi's firm letterhead, placed in an envelope addressed to Patricia and Gerald Marsh, sitting on the kitchen table where my mother would see it the moment she walked through the door. She saw it immediately. She set her handbag on the counter, the large canvas bag she had carried for years, the one with the broken zipper on the inner pocket that she had been meaning to repair since before Gerald. And she looked at the envelope and then at me. She said, "What is this?" I said, "It's from my attorney. I'd like you to read it before we talk." She looked at it for another moment. Then she picked it up and opened it. The letter was 4 paragraphs. Frances had written it clearly, and without unnecessary legal language, which I had specifically requested. The first paragraph established that the property at the Georgia Coast address was owned solely by Rachel Donovan, with no other parties holding any legal interest. The second paragraph noted that while guests were welcome by invitation, any extended occupancy required the written consent of the property owner. The third paragraph made clear that no such consent had been given, and that the owner wished to discuss arrangements before any decisions about occupancy were made. The fourth paragraph provided Frances's contact information and noted that any questions about the legal position of the parties should be directed to her. My mother read the letter slowly. I watched her face. She had a particular expression she used when she encountered something she had not expected, a slight tightening around the eyes, a way of going very still that she had probably learned to use in business situations early in her career and had never entirely stopped using in personal ones. Gerald had come in from the car by then, carrying a second bag, and he looked at my mother's face and at the letter in her hand and set the bag down without saying anything. My mother looked up from the letter. She said, "Rachel, we just sold our home." I said, "I know," she said. "We needed somewhere to—" I said, "Mom, I know. That's what I want to talk about." She put the letter on the kitchen table. She looked at Gerald, who had sat down on one of the bar stools at the kitchen counter, with the expression of a man who had prepared himself for a difficult conversation, and was now trying to determine whether this was the beginning of it or the middle. I had made coffee. I poured 3 cups and put them on the table and sat down. I said, I want to help. I want to figure out something that works for everyone. But I need you to understand something first. And I need you to actually hear it. Not just wait for me to finish saying it. This is my house. Not ours. Mine. And any arrangement we make is going to start from that being clear between us. My mother was quiet for a moment. Gerald looked at his coffee cup. Then she said, I didn't think you'd be so formal about it. I said, I'm not being formal, I'm being clear. Those are different things. Another silence. The sound of the marsh outside. The particular sound of water and birds that I had bought this house in order to hear whenever I wanted to, came through the screen door in a way that felt, right then, like the house itself participating in the conversation. My mother looked at the letter on the table. Then she looked at me. Something in her face shifted, not softened exactly, but adjusted. The way a person adjusts when they realize the situation they are in is not the situation they had planned for. She said, we didn't make any other arrangements. I said, I know you didn't. That's why I called Francis. She said, you called a lawyer before you called me. I said, I called a lawyer when I found out you had sold the house without telling me you were planning to come here. A longer silence. Gerald cleared his throat. He said, we probably should had a conversation. I said, yes. You probably should have. The stopped watch was in my bag. I had brought it with me from Raleigh, though I could not have explained exactly why. Sitting at that kitchen table, I was aware of its weight in the bag, the way you are aware of something you have been carrying long enough that you usually forget it is there. The conversation lasted 2.5 hours. It was not comfortable. My mother cycled through several positions, hurt, then defensive, then something closer to honest, and I let her cycle through them without interrupting, because I had learned in 16 years of legal work that people arrive at the truth in their own sequence, and that trying to rush the sequence usually delays it. What she eventually said, in the 3rd hour, with Gerald sitting quietly beside her and the marsh going gold in the evening light outside, was this: I thought you would just let us stay. I thought that's what family did. I said, family talks to each other. Family doesn't sell their house and show up with suitcases. She said, I was afraid you'd say no. I said, so you decided not to ask. She did not answer that, but she heard it. What happened after that Saturday morning was slower and quieter than the morning itself. Francis had prepared not only the letter, but a draft short-term occupancy agreement, a document that laid out, in clear and binding terms, the conditions under which my mother and Gerald could stay at the beach house for a defined period while they made permanent arrangements. The maximum duration was 90 days. The conditions included no alterations to the property, no additional guests without consent, contribution to utilities and groceries, and a written acknowledgement that the property was mine and that they held no claim to it. My mother signed it on the Monday, after the Saturday arrival. She signed it at the kitchen table with Gerald beside her, and the morning light coming through the windows over the marsh. And she used the pen I handed her and signed without reading it again, which told me she had read it very carefully the night before. Gerald signed more slowly. He read each clause. He initialed the margin notes. He asked one question, about the utility contribution calculation, and I answered it, and he nodded and signed. Whatever else I thought about Gerald, he understood documents. The 90 days ran into August. During those 90 days, 3 things happened that I had not anticipated. The first was that my mother began to relax into the beach house, in a way that was, despite everything, genuinely nice to witness. She had never lived near the water. She started waking up early to watch the marsh in the mornings, something I had always done and had never thought to tell her about, as though it were a private practice rather than something that would obviously appeal to a 68-year-old woman with a view of the Georgia coast. She bought a pair of binoculars. She learned the names of 3 different species of heron. She started a garden in the raised bed on the south side of the property that I had been meaning to plant for 2 years and had not gotten around to. The second was that Gerald, in the absence of the insurance industry, and the Carey suburb and whatever performance of retirement he had been giving in those contexts, turned out to be a fairly competent handyman. He replaced the railing on the front porch steps that had been loose since I bought the house. He resealed the windows on the north side. He fixed the screen door that had been squeaking since March. He asked before he did each thing, which I had not expected and which mattered to me more than the work itself. The third thing was harder. My mother and I had a conversation in the 6th week of the 90 days. On a Tuesday evening when Gerald had gone to bed early, and we were sitting on the screened porch with the marsh lights reflecting on the water. She told me that she and Gerald had been looking at properties in Brunswick, the mainland town nearest to the island, and that they had found a condominium they could afford with the proceeds from the Carey sale and a small contribution from Gerald's retirement account. She said, "I should have told you what we were planning before we sold the house." I said, "Yes," she said. "I was afraid of the conversation." I said, "I know. But the conversation we didn't have made a much harder conversation necessary." She looked at the water for a while. Then she said, "I thought you might say no to all of it, to us being nearby, to any of it." I said, "I might have had concerns. I would have had questions, but I wouldn't have said no to you being nearby. That's not what I was saying no to." She turned and looked at me. She said, "What were you saying no to?" I said, "I was saying no to you deciding for me, to you arranging things and arriving with suitcases and expecting me to accommodate decisions you had made about my life without asking me." She was quiet for a long time. The marsh made its particular evening sounds. An egret landed on the far bank and stood very still. She said, "Your grandmother used to say something about that." I said, "I know." She said, "I never thought I was doing the same thing." I said, "I know that too." My aunt called 2 weeks after that conversation, having heard some version of events from a cousin who had heard it from someone else. She was sympathetic in a way that felt like it was trying to gather information as much as offer support. I told her the situation was being handled and thanked her for calling. 2 other family members reached out during those 90 days. I received each call with the same response. Things are being worked out. No elaboration. Nothing that invited further conversation or opinion from people who did not have the full picture and did not need to be given it. The beach house during those months was quieter than it had been before my mother arrived, and louder than it had been when I was there alone. The balance was not always comfortable, but it was honest in a way that our relationship had not been for longer than I had realized until I was inside it differently. My apartment in Raleigh was dusty from underuse. I brought plants from there to the beach house, where they thrived in the coastal light. I started working remote 2 days a week from the screened porch, which my firm permitted, and which changed the texture of my weeks in ways I had not expected and did not regret. The condominium in Brunswick closed in late September. I drove my mother and Gerald to the closing, not because they needed me to. Gerald had managed the transaction himself, which was its own kind of competence, but because my mother had asked me to, and because saying yes to that was easy, and saying yes to easy things felt important after several months of navigating hard ones. The condominium was on the 2nd floor of a building 3 miles from the bridge to the island. 2 bedrooms, a balcony overlooking a canal, a kitchen with better light than my mother had expected, and less counter space than she wanted. She noted both things in the first 10 minutes of the walkthrough after closing, which was very much like her, and which I had stopped finding irritating sometime around the 7th week of the beach house summer. I drove home to the island that afternoon alone. The beach house in late September had a quality I had forgotten to anticipate, the particular quality of a place that had been full of people for several months returning to being yours alone. The railing Gerald had fixed was steady underfoot. The garden my mother had planted on the south side was in its last late-season effort, a few things still going that would not last another month. The screen door opened and closed without squeaking. I stood on the screened porch for a while in the evening light and looked at the marsh. On the small table beside my usual chair, the low wooden table I had bought at a market on the island during my first summer there, the stopped watch was sitting. I had taken it out of my bag at some point during the summer and set it there without deciding to. And it had stayed through the weeks of occupancy, and the conversation about the condominium and the closing day, and was still there now. I picked it up. The leather band was more worn than it had been. One of the small holes where the clasp fastened had widened slightly from use. From the times I had worn it to the closing on this house, from the time I had taken it with me to Francis's office, from whatever carrying and setting down and picking up it had done through the summer, the hands were still at 2:10. I took it to the watchmaker in Brunswick the following week. She had it running by Friday. I picked it up on Saturday morning and put it on my wrist and wore it home across the bridge to the island. My grandmother had said the most important thing a woman could own was something that was hers on paper. She was right, but she had also worn her watch every day for 40 years, which was its own kind of ownership, the kind that did not require a document. Here is what I have thought about most in the year since that Saturday morning with the suitcases on the porch. When someone who loves you makes a decision that affects your life without asking you, when they arrange things and arrive and expect you to accommodate what they have decided, is that a failure of communication, or is it something older than that? And what does it mean that the person they do it to is so often the one they trust most to absorb it? I do not have a clean answer. What I know is this. The letter on the kitchen table was not an act of cruelty, it was an act of clarity. And clarity, in my experience, is the only foundation on which anything honest can actually be built. My mother has a garden in Brunswick now. She calls me on Tuesdays. She comes to the island on some weekends, with advance notice, and she sits on the screened porch in the evenings and names the herons when they land. We are more honest with each other than we have been in a long time, possibly ever. That is not a small thing. The truth, delivered clearly, and without apology, is not the end of a relationship. Sometimes it is the beginning of a real one. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story stayed with you, I would be honored if you shared it with someone who might need it. Leave a comment and tell me where you are watching from, and whether you have ever had to choose truth when silence would have been easier. I read every single one. If you want more stories like this one, subscribe. I have many more to share, and I would love to have you here for the next one. The weeks between the signing of the occupancy agreement and the Brunswick closing were not simple, but they were honest in a way that our relationship had not managed before. My mother and I had always been close in the way of people who spend a great deal of time together and share a family history and a set of references and a particular shorthand that only makes sense to the two of them. What we had not been, for most of my adult life, was direct. We had talked around difficult things. We had absorbed friction, rather than naming it. We had operated on the assumption that the relationship was robust enough to contain whatever we didn't say, and neither of us had stopped to ask whether that assumption was actually true. The occupancy agreement changed that. Not immediately. The first 2 weeks were careful in the way of people who have just had an uncomfortable conversation and are not yet sure of the new terrain. But by the 3rd week, something had settled. My mother started talking to me differently, not about everything, not all at once, but in specific moments. A comment she made about something Gerald had said, a question she asked about my work that assumed a level of detail she had never previously thought to ask for. A Tuesday morning when she brought coffee to where I was working on the screened porch and sat down across from me without any particular agenda and just asked how things were going. How things were going, not as a pleasantry, as a question. I answered it honestly, which was new, and she listened, which was newer still. The Brunswick search had been going on in the background throughout the summer. Gerald managed most of it. He was methodical about property searches in a way that was actually useful, sending me links occasionally for my opinion, which I gave straightforwardly, and without the careful hedging I would have used a year earlier. He asked once whether there was anything I would specifically prefer in terms of proximity. I told him 30 minutes from the bridge felt right to me. Close enough to visit easily, far enough that visiting required a decision, he said. That makes sense. He said it without apparent resentment, which I had not expected, and which told me something about Gerald that I had not known. He was a man who could update his understanding of a situation when he was given clear information. That was not a small thing. My mother, toward the end of August, showed me a photograph of the Brunswick condominium on her phone. She held it toward me and said, "What do you think?" I looked at it. Second floor, canal view, reasonable kitchen, a balcony that would work for her morning coffee. I said, "I think it looks like it has good light," she said. "That's what I thought." She paused. "The balcony faces east." I said, "You'll want to be up early then." She smiled. She said, "I'm always up early now." She looked out toward the marsh. "This place does that to you." I did not say anything, but I thought, yes, it does. The relationships with extended family settled in their own way over those months. My aunt stopped calling. Once it became clear I was not going to provide the kind of detail that made for satisfying retelling. A cousin sent a message asking how things were going, and I replied that things were going well and left it there. People who were not inside the situation did not need to be invited into it. And I had spent enough professional years watching family disputes get worse from third-party involvement to feel certain about that. What I kept, and what mattered, was what was happening in the actual house, between the actual people, my mother learning the herons, Gerald fixing the porch railing, the Tuesday evening conversation on the screened porch that said more than any of the difficult conversations that had preceded it. These were the things that built something, slowly and imperfectly, on top of the thing that had almost broken.